Expert speakers, Miss Leah Renalder, Climate Change and Urban Environment Team, UNHabitat, Nairobi, Kenya. Dr. Prashant Vardhan, Assistant Professor, Department of Planning, SPA, Vijayawada. Respected Deans, HODs, faculty members, and our distinguished Director, Professor Dr. Ramesh Srikonda sir, and other distinguished participants and my dear students. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all for the workshop series on building inclusive cities for a resilient and sustainable future as a part of initiatives on academic collaboration in line with the MOU between SPA Vijayawada and UNHabitat. The first workshop under the theme Assessment Framework for Inclusive Cities Towards Resilient and Sustainable Development has been successfully completed during the January month, first week of January 2023. Today we all gathered here for the second workshop under the theme Urbanization and Climate Change. This workshop series has been designed under various themes for the whole year 2023 under 9 different themes by integrating all 5 inclusive dimensions of cities to achieve a resilient and sustainable future. I hope this workshop series will inculcate new thinking, gaining knowledge from real-time case studies and best practices across the globe. With these few words, I once again welcome you all for today's event. Now, I request our director, Professor Dr. Sri Ramesh Srikonda sir, to give inaugural address of the workshop 2 under the theme of urbanization and climate change. And at the outset, I would like to extend my warm welcome and also special thanks to our director for continuous support and encouragement to organize this kind of the collaborative workshops. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon to one and all. Distinguished experts from United Nations Human Settlement Program, Ms. Parul Agarwal, Country Program Manager, Ms. Mansi Satdev, Senior Urban Planner, respected speakers, Ms. Leah Renalder, Climate Change and Urban Environment Team, UNHabitat, Nairobi, Kenya, Dr. Prashant Vardhan, Assistant Professor, Department of Planning, School of Planning and Architecture, Vijayawada, India, Deans, HOD, faculty members, special invitees, my dear students. Greeting to each one of you present here. I am delighted to be present here today and to inaugurate and chair the opening ceremony for the workshop series on building inclusive cities for resilient and sustainable future. The second workshop under the theme of urbanization and climate change. This workshop series have been designed to shape and disseminate the knowledge with a series of 9 expert lectures on various themes every month, especially this year 2023, to provide skills, encourage participation and exchange of knowledge. This workshop will provide us not only the essential knowledge, but also a great opportunity to share experiences, both technical and regulatory issues which prevails in the system. I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to the coordinators of this workshop and in particular our expert speakers. With these few words, this is an opportunity time for me to declare the official opening of the workshop 2 session, that is on urbanization and climate change. I wish you all participants here for the today's interesting and beneficial session. Now I request Ms. Naina Gupta, Department of Planning, School of Planning and Architecture, Vijayawada, of our expert speaker, Ms. Leah Renalder of international repute. Thank you once again to all.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Ms. Leah Renalder. Ms. Leah Renalder is a postgraduate in environmental science and a part of the climate change and urban environments team at UNHabitat, where she works on renewable energy and climate change mitigation in cities. Prior, Ms. Leah has worked at the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st century, where she led the work stream on renewables in cities and policy at REN 21. She coordinated and led authored the research for the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report, and led REN's 21's work on renewable energy policies for the Renewables Global Status Report. She has also worked on public support for energy planning, youth engagement in the energy transition, and at a Swedish environmental NGO where she initiated divestment campaigns. We welcome you, ma'am, and we look forward for your presentation. We request you to kindly start with your presentation. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much for these warm, welcoming words. And I just want to make double sure that you can hear and see me all right. And please do let me know if the internet breaks. This is the perk of being based in Nairobi, that we often do have internet problems. So please do let me know, then I'll just turn off my camera to improve the audio quality. Let me share my screen. And please, one second, just while I get set up. Okay. Can you please confirm that you see my screen all right without any speaking notes or anything?
Yes, ma'am. We can see the presentation.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. I don't often use Google Meets, so this is a new one for me. So thanks very much for the opportunity to be here with you today. It's really exciting to speak about this topic of cities and climate change, and also really looking forward to questions and interacting with you all here on the call. Really a big honor to be here. You've already got a quick intro about me, Lea Ranalda, working at UNHabitat in the climate change team, specifically focusing on this link between cities and climate change, the importance of sustainable urbanization, and with a big focus on climate change mitigation and renewable energy issues here within UNHabitat. So what I'll do today during this call is sort of say four things. A little bit of an intro to UN Habitat and the climate work we do, then zooming out and saying, why do we even need to talk about cities and climate change, giving you some case studies of what cities have done to tackle climate change, and also the work UN Habitat has done in order to support these, and then finishing off with cities in the international climate agenda, specifically related to the COP processes, since COP27 just finished in November, and we've had some pretty exciting new things happening there. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to also share some of these things with all of you. So let me, without further ado, dive directly into this first topic, UN Habitat and its focus on climate action. I think most of you have already heard about UN Habitat and what we do. So this is just a really brief reminder of some of our strategies and core issues that we do work on. I would like to point out, of course, here the aspect of strengthened climate action and improved urban environment. That's one of the core issues in our strategic plan, and that's also where I'll be diving into specifically in this presentation, what we do around that. So the priorities that we have, again, just really on a high level. Adequate housing for all cities as a driver of change, which of course links very much with the climate change debate, and then localizing sustainable development goals. And then if we, some of the things that we do when it comes to tackling climate change is, of course, being a thought leader, generating that specialized and cutting edge knowledge, and acting as a multiplier when it comes to climate change issues. Then we are working on climate action through several programs and initiatives on climate change, on mobility, on energy. And we've had a massive program also on low emission development strategies in cities. Then we, of course, share this expertise on sustainable urbanization, climate resilience, adaptation planning, and mitigation strategy. And then we are a big partner. climate change is not something that can be tackled just by one agency itself. It's really important that there's a collaboration across agencies. So we do partner with other agencies. We partner with local government networks, with the LGMA, and that's the local government and municipal authority constituency to the UNFCCC, with city networks such as ICLE, C40, the Global Covenant of Mayors. We partner with professional networks, strategic networks, and also academia. There's lots of acronyms there. I'm not going to go into details, but it's more to give you a little bit of a sense what the kind of partnerships and work is that we do when it comes to the climate, with the climate lens, so to say. So that's just a 2-minute summary of the work we do on climate change. But let me get to the core of this presentation, which is really talking about why do we even need to talk about cities and climate change? I want to get us started with a quote here from the Secretary General, where it is. I think it's already over 2 years old, but I think it summarizes it quite well, where he says that the world's cities are fundamental front lines on sustainable development, vulnerable to disasters, yet vectors of innovation and dynamism. Let us not forget that more than 50% of humankind already lives in cities, and this number will reach almost 70% in 2050. So this is also just to say that this importance of cities is definitely recognized also within the UN system as a whole. So as that quote already says, there's more than 50% of the urban population living in cities. We're expecting another 2.5 billion more people living in cities by 2030. And with this rising urbanization, rising prosperity, but also population growth in cities, we've seen the share and the urban share of greenhouse gas emissions rise quite significantly over the last years. It's currently around 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Cities are also responsible for a similar amount of energy consumption, and as we all know, it's quite difficult to measure, who's responsible for what share of the greenhouse gas emissions. But it's even expected if we consider interactions with rural communities and consumption and all the things that are being consumed in cities, that this share could well be also higher. So this is just to say cities are a driver of climate change issues with their responsibilities for emissions and also energy use. They're also, maybe just to say, they are responsible for around 80% of the global GDP. So they're definitely also powerhouses when it comes to, of course, consumption, but then, of course, also money available sitting in cities. Cities are drivers of climate change, but they're also incredibly vulnerable to climate change. More than 1 billion people living in informal settlements. There's already today 1.6 to 3.3 billion people living in hotspots, highly vulnerable to climate change. And you can guess that the overlap between the ones living in informal settlements and the ones vulnerable to climate change is very, very high. Why is that? Because we see people in informal settlements often settling in areas that are prone to flooding, that are very prone to landslides and disasters like that. We see, and now especially, and they of course also are living in very precarious, not only situation, but also precarious tenure situation with illegal evictions. So there is no living stability. Now we've seen a quite big disruption adding onto this with food insecurity, rising cost of livings, energy crisis, and all of this is hitting, of course, the most vulnerable in cities the most, in addition to already the quite big stresses from climate change. And so you would think, okay, well, if it's such a big issue, everybody should be jumping at that opportunity and at the necessity to provide finance. But that's, of course, unfortunately not the case. So estimates vary, but there's been approximately $384 billion already invested in urban areas. but that's less than 10% of what is necessary for low carbon and resilient urban development. So the estimated annual costs are over 4.5 trillion. Again, depending a little bit on which parameters you choose for making these assumptions. What we can agree on, it's a lot. A lot of money is needed, and not nearly enough is reaching the local level. And in addition to that, we see, if we look at global climate finance streams, is that there is already very, very little money going to climate change adaptation issues, and then even less money going to climate change adaptation issues at the local level. And maybe to add on this finance aspect is that the issue is also that many city governments cannot, either they have a very low tax base, income base for climate change projects, or in general for anything that they would like to do, of course, depending on the local circumstances, but often they can also not participate and borrow money on their national markets or even international markets. So getting this financing of climate issues in cities is incredibly difficult. And there are many actors involving in trying to tackle this issue, but it's a quite complex and very depending very much on local issues. And I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail in just a second. And then also we see that national urban commitments are critical. So the link between national urban commitments and cities at the global level, we do see that there is more and more recognition of cities, and this growing awareness of cities in the climate change, global climate change space. There is growing urban. We see a growing urban content of in NDCs, but yet if we look at national urban policies that explicitly focus on climate change, that number is very low. So just to showcase that briefly, and I'll dive into this now here in this slide, and I'll pick that back up in just a couple minutes when we talk about the COP engagement and why this COP engagement is so important. So this is a brand new study that just got published last month from a colleague here in the climate change team, and that did show that around 2/3 of the submitted NDCs have urban content, so that's the new NDCs. Yet if we look at how strong that urban content is, there's of course a variety with, approximately 1/3 of the urban content being split between strong, moderate, and low or no urban content. And we do see that, there is, there is quite a big focus. We see some integrated thinking on mitigation adaptation content, but all of this can always be strengthened. While this is in general quite good news, we're not there yet in terms of really making that happen. So talk briefly about cities and climate change, and now I would like to go a little bit deeper into what has already happened in terms of climate action at the city level. Why is this even so important, and what can cities do? And then I'll get to some of these case studies. So in general, we've seen that there's more than 11,500 cities committed to climate action, lots of that via the Global Covenant of Mayors. There's also the cities Race to Zero, where there's over 1,000 cities committed to reaching net zero emissions by latest 2050. We've seen city governments leading by example, so including sustainability or renewable energy into their purchasing decisions. What does that mean? So that says, for example, we are procuring procuring something for our city, and we're making it a requirement that it needs to be, for example, electrified. We're not accepting any more gas or oil boilers. It really needs to be a specific system there. They're saying they're prioritizing electric public transport over conventional buses. So really making that already in the procurement decisions quite specific, that there are certain sustainability criteria that would have to be met. We've seen quite a big focus of retrofitting of houses, which of course is specifically in Europe a quite big undertaking, where the renovation rate is currently less than 1%. And if you really want to tackle climate action there, it's about not only making sure that new buildings you build are being built with the highest sustainability criteria, but also that you retrofit existing buildings to really insulate them, to make sure that you have energy efficiency integrated into that you have that you're mixing green spaces and integrating that into the building design also for retrofitting. So we've seen cities providing specific funds to make such retrofitting happening, or retrofitting their own buildings. And then another thing which I'm personally, as an energy person, quite excited about is this passing of mandates for renewable energy, especially for new buildings. So we've seen now, and again, I'll get into this in a little bit with an example. We've seen that some city governments say, in my city, no new building can be built without solar PV on the roof. And that's quite exciting because, as far as I know, and I'm happy to be corrected, there's no national government that has a similar policy. That's based on the research I did about a year ago. But of course, I'd be very happy to be stand corrected here. But just to see that we see city governments taking the lead and saying we're making it mandatory to put solar PV on new buildings in our city. It doesn't matter if they're residential, commercial, industrial buildings, they need to have solar PV. And some cities even say if you're doing major renovations on your house, you need to integrate solar PV or solar thermal on your rooftop. And then, of course, seeing this entry point for neighborhood planning and for integrated solutions. So thinking around, there is a neighborhood, we of course not only need low carbon buildings, but there needs to be public transport there, really well connected. How can we think around making sure that people living in that neighborhood don't have to travel very long distances to get to work, to go shopping? Here an example is what Paris is right now pioneering, is this 15-minute city, with the idea that within 15 minutes you can reach every single thing that you would need for your daily life. Playgrounds, entertainment, food, bars, restaurants, and ideally also your place of work. And then, as a last thing, which I think again is really exciting, is seeing how city governments are using climate action to also engage with civil society, engage with the people living in the city. Using that as an approach for participatory planning, participatory approaches. I'll tell you again an example from Paris, just because that's where I lived before Nairobi, is I got to vote on a certain part of the municipal budget, how it's being used. So I could say, look, I really want the city government to put more focus on and greening the city, on putting in bike paths, on expanding public transport. And so that's of course one part of the municipal budget that would then get voted on by everybody living in the city. But of course it also had an effect into the entire municipal planning. If they saw lots of people requiring certain measures that had the trickle down effect into the city, of course, putting an increased focus on that. And we've seen that not only in Paris, there are fantastic examples from around the world of this participatory planning, workshops, engaging with civil society. And here again, building on the strength and the power that cities have. Most of us may have met our mayor of the city we've lived in. I don't think many have met a president or prime minister necessarily, but there is this engagement with the city level that can be, of course, depending on the city size, fully aware that some cities are bigger than countries, but can be quite beneficial, specifically when we talk about some of these smaller cities where the engagement on priority actions can really be discussed in a quite personal setting as well. So let me allow to have a quick sip of water. Mm. Before diving into some of these case studies, just to make it tangible of what what I was talking about. So one case study, a brief one, which is really about the solar PV and solar mandate, is Berlin. And what's exciting here is that they've just now, as of 6 weeks, it is mandatory to have a solar PV on new buildings, both residential and commercial, and also when there's a major building renovations being done. And that just it got voted, I think, in 2021, and just got into fast force 1st of January of this year. And it feeds quite well with the master plan that Berlin has of becoming a solar city. And if you've ever been to Berlin, it's not necessarily the sunniest city in the universe, but it really does show that there is a big focus and opportunity to use solar also in cities that are maybe a little bit colder and foggier. Then an example of, also from UNHabitat's work and from Ormoc City in the Philippines, where it was really about building this climate resilient design. The city had experienced quite significant urban and socioeconomic developments, but was exposed to climate hazards as floods, storm surge, rain, and so on, really placing the city at risk of climate change impacts. And the city did recognize that urban design is not only about addressing structural and technological gaps, but also managing these climate impacts. So this is where this climate resilient design came in. And you can see some of these steps that were being undertaken on the slide, but really having a citywide climate action plan was set up, identifying the hotspots, and then using this participatory urban design, including capacity development and climate finance support, to really building this climate resilient city. Informal settlement upgrading, heat adaptive and disaster resilient housing, thinking about the coastal zones in a little bit more detail, and then using nature-based solutions along the river and upstream as well, in really transforming the city. Another example is, this is now from a Climate Smart Cities Challenge that UNHabitat ran, which really was harnessing, with the aim of harnessing the creativity and energy of innovators to work with cities to help achieve these global net zero targets and creating a better future for everyone. So this is the example of Bogota, one of the participants of this Climate Smart Cities Challenge. And their goal was really, we want to improve freight mobility and reduce congestion based on greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants in Bogota. And for those of you who've ever been to Bogota, I've spent 3 to 4 hours just trying to get out of the city, just stuck in traffic. So there is definitely a need to reducing congestion in the city. And interestingly, the city has become a leader for urban cycling in South America during the COVID pandemic, really attract worldwide attention for being one of the first city to install temporary bike lanes, and which was then an example later on followed by many cities around the world. The strategic plan running up to 24 also has the goal to further expand bike infrastructure and making cycling a priority transportation mode. The city has one of the biggest electric bus fleets outside of China. Really, one of the city with the biggest electric bus fleets outside of China. So now they're really, as part of this challenge, thinking about how can we get innovative business models that can improve the freight mobility in the city and reduce this congestion. And that's currently, there's been winners announced for this challenge, and really collaboration is about to start here. Similar thing in Bristol, which has also been as the first UK city declaring a climate emergency already in 2018. There is a climate emergency action plan. The city is working with city partners, with the council, and so on, for really and it's also calling on the government for increased powers and resources for leadership through policies and taxation. But so the city is a front runner, but what they really need is having a new model for delivering this affordable zero carbon homes. They're facing a climate emergency, they're facing a housing crisis. So, really, how can you make sure that you build new buildings that are affordable, energy efficient, climate resilience, and contribute to reducing the carbon footprint? So, again, interested, integrated thinking here, how we can combine affordability and carbon neutrality. And now just some very actually brand new examples from the climate change team from our RISA portfolio. So that's from building the resilience of the urban poor. And that's one example of mangrove restoration in Morun Dawa in Madagascar, which has an approximate population of 60,000, is a rapidly urbanizing, relatively young population, extremely prone to flooding and soil erosion because they have poor drainage and weak solid waste management systems. And what they've done is there was really the idea we need to adapt to the impact of waves and wind on the coastal settlement. So there was, in collaboration with UNHabitat, this project team that decided to build on existing efforts to restore mangroves. So 89 hectares of mangroves were restored, and that was a community effort, and in the end benefited not only people in Morondava, but also in neighboring communities in building that better resilience, climate resilience. And then, as a last example, is the tree planting in Malawi, specifically in Lilongwe City, which has a population of more than 1 million people. More than 70% of these residents live in informal settlements that are poorly drained and flood prone. So there was this Lilongwe Resilient Framework for Action that was developed in 2019 by the City Council with the support from UN Habitat, and they identified and the communities identified vegetative cover restoration as one of the most relevant nature-based risk reduction measures. So the community planted around 3,500 trees to protect the areas from flood. And these activities reduced the impact of floods for over 78,000 people. And the project also aims to expand the roles of residents beyond the planting of trees, really encouraging them to take initiative, assist in preservation and maintenance, and building ownership and best practices of this. So you've heard some examples now on what cities have done, what cities can do, but now I'd like to take a step back and discuss some of these challenges and opportunities of cities in the international climate agenda. I mean, cities have done a lot of things, but there are these challenges, which is this issue of multi-level governance. The current NDCs are clearly NDCs, nationally determined contributions from countries, are clearly not enough to respond to the climate emergency. They can be strengthened in terms of urban content. We are not achieving the Paris Agreement currently. We are in a climate emergency mode, and yet what we do see is that cities often do not have a place at the table, although they're responsible for over 70% of the emissions. And that many of the policies that affect cities are being set at a higher level of government, so either at the state, regional level, or at the national level. And that's for, many of the climate policies, it's taxation, it is specifically also when it comes to energy. We spoke about finance, that finance is not enough. There is a lack of local capacity, so even when there's money available, often cities lack the capacity and human and technical resources to tackle climate change. There has been a study done that greenhouse gas emissions in cities could be reduced by almost 90% by 2050 and with technically feasible and available measures, but the technologies and the innovation does not reach the local level. And then, as a last thing, is that it's often the most vulnerable group that are disproportionately and adversely affected by climate change, although they're the ones that are contributing the least to urban emissions. And this is where some of the efforts come in that UNHabitat has undertaken in the last half year. So at COP27, in the lead up to COP27, the Egyptian COP27 presidency launched a variety of initiatives, and one of them was an initiative on cities. So the Surge Initiative, Sustainable Urban Resilience for the Next Generation. And what was exciting about this is it was the first time that there was a presidency that acknowledged cities and the importance of sustainable cities in that matter, in that depth, and giving cities, the space with their own initiative. So that was developed in collaboration with UNHabitat and also facilitated by ICLE, and with this goal to enhancing and accelerating local and urban climate action through multi-level governance, engagement, and delivery, with this vision to transforming cities to be healthy, sustainable, just, inclusive, low emission, and resilient urban system for a better future. Quite an inclusive and collaborative approach, had several multi-stakeholder engagement meetings throughout the last year. At the World Urban Forum, there was a stakeholder consultation meeting in Cairo, in Nairobi, and then the launch at the ministerial meeting. I won't go into too much detail about all the tracks and opportunities, but just the idea is that we need to work across a variety of tracks, but also have an integrated thinking along how to deliver on this sustainable urbanization. The initiative was launched at a ministerial meeting at COP27, and maybe also to say, why is this so exciting? Is because it was the first time there was a ministerial meeting on urbanization and climate change at a COP, bringing together more than 60 ministers of urban development and housing, mayors, and very high senior officials from UN agencies. So very exciting to see such a very strong engagement along this importance of cities for tackling climate change. And just as a side note, the room was packed. There was so much engagement from all the non-state actors as well, and so much excitement about this, although this meeting was on the last day of the climate talks. And some of these things on, okay, how is this initiative going to deliver, is really about strengthening the implementation of the climate agenda in and with cities, and it's about addressing urbanization and this multi-level governance. It is about enhancing the recognition of local climate action also at the national level, and raising the ambition of local climate action at the same time. More than 160 organizations, partners, cities, national governments have signed up, and the sign-ups and endorsements for this keep coming in. And we're really right now in the process of figuring out what can be done in the road to COP28. How can we work with all these different partners? How can we make sure that we have another ministerial meeting, that we really bring cities and the importance of cities to this global arena and this global agenda? And that's it from my side. I would like to just close with the following, saying it's not only about tackling, bringing cities to this climate agenda for the climate agenda's sake, but it's really also a massive opportunity for socioeconomic development at the local level, for job creation. I mean, if we speak about renewable energy, it's very much about local solutions, specifically when it comes to buildings, for transforming how we heat our buildings. It's about tackling air pollution in cities. It's about really having this aspect of upgrading cities, upgrading informal settlements, and just having a greener, healthier, and more livable city for everybody. I'll close here, and of course, if there are any questions, happy to answer.
Thank you, ma'am. This is Rajiv, Assistant Professor from SP Vijayawada. Representing SP Vijayawada, I just handling this session. So we'll keep the questions. I request all the audience to keep the questions towards the end, such that we'll hear both the speakers, and then we'll have an engaging session. So Adnan sir, would you want to add something?
No, you just continue.
So before we move on to the next speaker, I would like to quickly thank Madam for sparing her time and introducing to the audience quite an informative session on climate change and cities. So, wherein Ma'am was telling about cities as drivers of climate change, but at the same time being quite vulnerable to climate change at the same time. So they are the people who are contributing to it, but at the same time facing the brunt of it. And then we did move on to discussing on the complexities in the climate actions that are involved and the complex relationships between the various climate actors who are there. And then we also had a discussion on the entry points, the various entry points for urban climate action that is possible and that has been taken, and where UNHabitat has taken long strides in having lot many projects, wherein she has introduced few case studies of the lot list, wherein they've tried to think on low carbon solutions, climate resilient urban development, smart solutions which targeted climate actions, and also on even nature based solutions where through mangrove regrowing the mangroves, etc., how we can tackle climate change, which is a big global concern. And also, finally, we kind of summarized on the cities in the international agenda and how the local summit, we kind of summarized on it was a big discussion. So we summarized on the local solutions, how it can lead to and contribute to the global challenge that we are facing in climate change. So that's just a quick wrap up of what I was able to, I have understood through this session. And I thank Madam for sparing her time. And with this, I take the opportunity to introduce the second speaker for the day. We have with us Dr. Prashant Vardhan. So, sir is a planner and an academician having more than 15 years of experience. Currently, he is working as an assistant professor in School of Planning and Architecture, Vijayawada, India. His core interest in planning and development lies in land management, land-based financing, urban infrastructure planning and management, and applications of GIS in urban planning. That's just a short listing of his interest areas. And he's completed his bachelor's in planning and master's in planning, specializing in infrastructure planning. And beyond academics, as an academician, beyond that, he's actively involved in various SPA Vijayawada consultancy projects and research projects. So with that short bio, I request Dr. Prashant Vardhan to start the session. Over to you.
Thank you, Rajiv. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, okay. So I hope the screen is visible to you. Rajiv, can you please confirm?
Yes, screen is visible, sir, and it is on full screen mode.
Okay, so yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I thank the coordinators and the director for giving me this opportunity. So today, my presentation is focusing on urbanization and climate change, presenting you the existing and upcoming challenges in Indian perspective. So, as a part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about three important things today. First, I will discuss on the present status of urbanization in India and climate change importance for Indian cities. And then I will talk about the existing scenario of urban infrastructure in Indian cities, linking it to climate change. And subsequently, I will discuss or I will introduce you one of the important concerns in India, that is financing the climate resilient infrastructure. So, you all must be knowing this, that Indian cities are now in the forefront on making climate action plans. We have various approaches advocated on sustainable urbanization. We have approaches focusing on increasing the adaptive capacities of our settlements. And lastly, we have a few approaches to or advocating on having this climate resilient urban infrastructure. So, in this context, I would like to highlight one point here is that every action of these plans or any strategy that we are intending to introduce in our Indian cities has development costs associated with them, and nothing is for free. Municipalities have to be in a position to finance them. If Indian municipalities are not in a position to finance them, there is a higher probability that these plans are limited to documents, or we may see some plans getting implemented whenever they have grants made available. So there are a few concerns in India raised by practitioners, researchers, and others on the consistency and the level of sufficiency and future proofing of these plans that we are making today. So my presentation will try and make an attempt to introduce you all of this, referring to the present status of municipal finances in India. So this presentation is made keeping audience into consideration. So there are a few slides that introduces you to the basics, which are well known to the practitioners and academicians. So kindly bear with me about that. So I'd like to start referring to this phenomenon of urbanization in India, which is inevitable for economic growth. So the existing levels of in our country may be at 40% today as per the estimates, but there will be a day where we reach 60% and above. So you all must be knowing this fact that urbanization in India has been slow and witnessed lower growth rates as compared to other developing countries. But it is very important to observe here that the magnitude of population living in urban areas in India today, with this 35 to 40% urbanization, is itself very high as compared to many developed countries which have urbanization more than 60 or 70%. So, as per the reported figures in 2021, India stands at second position in population size after China. But as on today, there are estimates which undoubtedly mention that India ranks first with respect to population size. So it is very important for all of us to remember this, that we are dealing with a country which has relatively high population with complex socio-economic and settlement structures. So, as per UN projections, 35% of the projected urban population until 2050 will be in three countries: India, China, and Nigeria. Among these three, India will have the highest absolute increase in population. Further, I would like to discuss a few seconds about this urbanization. So, usually it refers to the percentage of population living in urban areas, and the definition also refers to the transformation of the built form from rural to urban. It refers to change in lifestyle, culture, behavior, and they all have been proven that they have a direct relationship with the energy demand, emissions, pollutions, and climate change. So, here, this makes us clear that when there is a rise in urbanization in our country, there will also be a rise in pollution, carbon footprints, and higher the impacts will be due to climate change, and which is very important for us to know. So we have to learn to those strategies or adapt those strategies that minimizes the impact of climate change, and also the strategies that help in reducing the impact of urbanization on climate. Moving forward, here I would like to draw your attention on climate change. So it is well stated that climate change is the most significant threat to life on Earth, both the natural and anthropogenic emissions of air pollution, especially the greenhouse gases, have been causing large scale effects on climate. And there is also an established evidence on the relationship between this air pollution and climate change is primarily driven by the greenhouse gases. What is important is it is well understood that much of the energy consumed in our urban areas, especially in India, is primarily produced through fossil fuels. And this concentration of urban population is associated with higher emissions. And as earlier said by the speaker, more than 70% of the CO2 emissions is coming from the urban areas. And a surprising thing to note here is that it is estimated that India, due to its population size, is the third largest emitter of GHG emissions in the world. But I also want to say this that when we compare the per capita emissions in India, it is less than half of what a few developed and developing countries emit today. So the urban climate change related risks in our cities estimated to have widespread negative impacts, and these risks are amplified as it was also seen in the previous presentation for those who are living in the informal settlements. Lastly, I would like to make one point is that the spatial settlement pattern and the socio-economic characteristics of Indian settlements are very important because they are the critical factors in the interactions among the urbanization, climate change, risks, and vulnerability. So this slide presents you the urban temperature variation. This is the projected climate change in degrees by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the mid 21st century. So this map also has the large urban agglomeration map on the projected climate change. So here RCP 8.5 refers to the concentration of carbon that delivers global warming at a rate of 8.5 watts per square meter. Here the projection states that in India there is an increase in temperature, average increase in temperature by 2 degrees. And this projection does not include the urban heat island effect. So if we add that effect into it, we can assume that there will be an increase in temperature more than 2 degrees. And at that juncture, it becomes important for us to know how this projected climate change influence the exposure of urban settlement and sensitivity. So coming to that, the climate change and forecasts indicate that there is an exposure of city residents, buildings, infrastructure, and various sectors, which eventually put them into risks. And there are two types of impacts that the planners and economists and architects have to understand. First one is the direct impact, and the second one is the systemic impacts. So to sensitize us further, I have referred to a few research studies carried out on air pollution in India. So, a recent study on the impact of air pollution on child health in India reveals that air pollution in India has an adverse effect on the child health in various ways. And the Global Burden of Disease India study was also estimated that in our country, the under 5 age deaths per 1 lakh population attributable to air pollution in 2019 is around 100 plus in male and also 100 plus in female, which is very high as compared to the targets or benchmarks what we have in our country. So research findings also mention that the effect of air pollution on health, especially in child, does not start at very late. It begins at the very early stages and their impacts are seen throughout. Moving forward, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation has forecasted data on top 10 risks contributing to the total number of disability adjusted life years in India. So here you must be knowing this, that one disability adjusted life year represents the loss of equivalent of 1 year of full health. So this study highlights that air pollution as the second most risk in our country. And overall, if you see, India is the seventh most affected country as per the Climate Risks Index of 2019. So the earlier slides were only referring to the impact of air pollution on child health, and we were discussing about the top 10 risks identified by studies. But what is important to note here is that there are many such things which are and will have a significant impact on urban areas. For example, the droughts, heat waves will have impact on our urban settlements. There will be the higher the impact on vulnerable settlements or vulnerable groups like senior citizens, children's, or population with pre-existing health conditions, etc. So at this juncture, I can say that in India, every action that we introduce or plan we introduce to improve the resilience of cities will matter a lot to us. And there are differential risks. I would like to repeat this, that there are differential risks in our cities. And so one plan or one action does not address the problems of all. So there should be a concentrated efforts to have plans addressing all. Moving forward, having introduced to the concept of urbanization and climate change, I would like to highlight here that in India, we have two different challenges before us. So there are issues or concerns that need to be addressed in urbanization, and there are also upcoming issues and challenges of climate change that need to be addressed. With respect to urbanization, we have concerns like availability and quality of infrastructure services, the urban form, the land use changes, financial capacity and sustainability of the local bodies, the quality of life, etc. With respect to climate change, we have vulnerable groups. It was informed in the previous presentation also. We have vulnerable groups. Then we need to create resilient infrastructure to climate change. We have to take care of the adaptive capacities and introduce the mitigation strategies, and others to take care. So we have heard about the climate change in the previous sessions, and there are more presentations scheduled on this topic. So I would like to further discuss and limit my presentation on urbanization and challenges linking them to climate change in my upcoming slides. So this slide gives you the existing snapshot of urban infrastructure and services in India. It is little old, but there is not much change, I believe, in it. So there has been a rapid increase in urban population in India, and due to the economic diversification that is happening in the last 30 years, there is a tremendous pressure and there is an additional demand created on urban infrastructure and services. So as you might be aware of this, that as per the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, provision of urban infrastructure services falls in the functional domain of local bodies. So on the other side, we have researchers point out to a strong correlation or association between infrastructure quality, availability of infrastructure, and economic performance of cities. If I were to relate this to climate change, I can say that the adaptive capacity of your city depends on the quality of infrastructure and coverage of infrastructure and services. So if we observe the bar charts that are placed on the left side of the slide, they indicate the current status of urban infrastructure services and a comparison with the benchmarks. So here the assessment done by the group reveals that the performance of Indian cities is regarded as poor, and there is also a significant gap in India. So here comes the question in our mind, that why Indian cities were not able to provide quality infrastructure to the citizens, and what are the reasons? If we assume that the governments follow the current approach in providing infrastructure, what would be the vulnerability of the settlements which are growing today faster? And this even to be examined when disasters happen in those urban areas. So to sensitize us further on this, I have referred to the lifeline utilities, because most of the studies on climate change talk about access to lifeline utilities. So this is the recent finding. This slide presents you the findings on that. The first one is on the people using at least basic drinking water services in urban areas. And the data indicates that there is an improvement in India as compared to other cities, but we fall much behind. The same is the case in urban sanitation. So from the previous slide, previous slides, we can relate this that when you have low levels of access to this lifeline utilities, the higher is the vulnerability and risks related to shocks and stress levels will also be higher. So what is important here is the capacity of urban local bodies to finance this infrastructure in India. So before I talk about the existing status of municipal finances in India, I will briefly present you the existing and upcoming challenges identified in urban infrastructure by various task force appointed in India. So the first thing we have already discussed. The second greatest challenge which is mentioned is energy. As more and more people come to urban areas in India, there is more demand to fuel consumption. So there are challenges related to supply, sufficiency, and sustainability. So to give you an example on this, how the consumption of the fossil fuels by the population is regulated by the government in urban areas in India, and how the social costs of excess consumption of energy is accounted in the pricing reforms, and how the resource efficiency is analyzed by the local governments, and how are they made responsible to achieve the efficiency. And the third challenge, which they've identified as the fresh water, which I've shown in the previous slide. And the fourth challenge relates to social infrastructure, which I feel is very important for Indian cities as on today. The question is how we collectively and individually will finance the cost of more people living longer and having fewer children. So the recent pandemic is one such example which indicates the importance of this facility. It's not just about the facility and its financing, and it is also about how do you make this facility available at an affordable price becomes more important to us. So these are complexities in infrastructure. I think I will skip this because some of it is already discussed in the previous slide, previous presentation. So coming to the infrastructure development with respect to climate change. So the recent research findings are presented here. The level of funding needed for sound adaptation could exceed the capacities of local and national governments and also the international agencies. Much of this investment will have to come from individuals, households, communities, and ULBs. And land use planning and management have an important role in ensuring sufficient land for housing that avoids dangerous sites and protects key ecological services and systems. So, having introduced you to this urban infrastructure challenges, now I will spend some time in discussing about the status of the municipal finances in India. So this slide presents you the three tiers of government structure and the finances in India. We have central government, they have their own sources of revenues, state government, and then we have local government. So due to time constraint, I will only introduce you briefly on the local governments. In addition to the local or internal sources of local governments in India, the local governments in India have their physical dependency on state and central government. So the central governments through state central finance commissions and ministries provide finances or grants to ULBs in India through state governments, and further the state governments from their own sources of revenues provide grants to ULBs in India. So what is important for us to remember is municipalities in India have been entrusted to finance the urban infrastructure, and they have a larger role to play, especially on urban infrastructure as compared to the state and central. So there is a problem in India regarding this. and people and governments are working towards increasing the financial capacities and sustainability of municipal finances. This chart presents the share of own revenues, both the taxes and non-taxes, in the total revenues of urban local bodies in India. So here, if you observe, it indicates that own revenues has declined over the time, while that of the government transfers has increased, indicating that there is a growing physical dependency by local bodies in India on upper level governments. In India, the municipal revenues consist of taxes, non-tax revenues, and transfers. So these tax revenues, what we have, account for about 30 to 35% of the total revenues. Among them, among various revenue sources, property tax is the principal source of revenue. And the recent study by the Reserve Bank of India in India and other institutions indicate that there are a large variations within the municipal corporations and municipalities. This is very important for all of you. Uh, What it says is, though the taxes are the principal sources of revenues to municipalities, within the same category of ULB, we have variations with respect to their financial position. There are some municipalities which have higher capacity, and there are a few municipalities with less capacities compared to others. So, variations among the municipal corporations or municipalities in India is something which underpins the sufficiency of their revenues for infrastructure investments. So, however, at the country level, if you aggregate all this to the country level, the property tax collection in India, what we have in urban areas, is much lower as compared to other OECD countries due to several factors as identified, like we have property undervaluation, we have incomplete registers, we have policy inadequacy, and ineffective administration. Though there is a greater variability in property tax mobilized, the research findings indicate that the level of urbanization and the urban population densities have positive correlation, which means if a ULB has higher the population size, we can assume that they are relatively better in terms of financing their infrastructure. Now the question comes to all Indian planners is that we have a large share of small and medium municipalities with low densities. And if I relate it to the research carried out on climate, emissions, etc., they are associated with higher emissions. And they also have low property tax collection efficiency and capacities to raise revenues. So, which is an alarming situation to Indian planners. If these things are left addressed, then one can assume about the quality of infrastructure and the amount of GHG emissions that we will be having in our Indian settlements. So there is an urgent need to bring in reforms to improve the economic efficiency of this the property taxation and also the user charging reforms in India. Adding further to what was explained in the previous slide, uh, there are various studies on municipal finances which have indicated that this is at a larger level. If you see, there is a mismatch between the functions that are entrusted to urban local bodies and the finances that they have. So the own revenues like user charges, own taxes, etc., they are inadequate to meet the required the expenditure levels, to meet the expenditure levels as per the normative basis. So there is also a research which says that our local bodies are highly dependent on grants even for operating and maintaining the infrastructure which is in place. And there are some studies which indicate that Indian local bodies are among the weakest globally in terms of the fiscal autonomy. And given to this scenario, how do you expect that these municipalities to finance the climate resilient infrastructure? And it is a big challenge to Indian cities. And will there be an increase in grants from central and state governments to local bodies? And the second question is, what is the share of the development costs which need to be financed by the people living in these urban areas, especially in those ULBs where the poverty levels are high? So there are many such questions which need to be researched upon by Indian planners and economists currently if we relate this subject to climate change. So since I've been talking about the small and medium towns, I thought I'll also present you one slide on what is the status of the small and medium municipalities as compared to the higher order municipalities in India. So this is a part of my research finding. So the summary of the key results are shown in this slide. First thing is that the higher the size of the municipality indicates a relatively better physical position. And overall, it is observed that the dependency on grants was more than 40% in case of class 2 ULBs in Andhra and 25% in case of class 3. Further, the efficiency of the municipal revenues were also analyzed through supporting variables. And I'm not discussing about in detail on all, but the results point out that the efficiency of municipal revenues of the higher order cities was relatively better as compared to the smaller order cities. And the sufficiency of municipal expenditures, which is an important concern, as you see in many of the research studies on climate change and financing the climate resilience infrastructure. When we talk about the sufficiency of municipal expenditures, it is very high. I mean, we are spending very less as compared to what is required by for various infrastructure facilities, and the level of sufficiency or underspending goes as high as 80% in case of class 3 municipalities. So there are many such things. Overall, if we conclude this, we can say that they are heavily dependent on government, and they are not even having revenues to take care of their functions which are entrusted to them by the government. And one interesting thing which I would like to highlight here is that uh, in some states in India, the salaries of the municipal employees are paid from the treasury. If we assume that the salaries are to be paid from the internal revenues of the municipal bodies, then the financial sustainability and risks what we have will be further amplified. Given to this scenario, if you look into the projections in Indian context, the ULBs or urban local bodies are expected to utilize their own revenues and exploit the sources to finance the infrastructure. And if you can see the graph which is placed there, it says that own revenues of this ULBs have to be increased by 1.47% or increased to 1.4% of the GDP from the existing levels of about 0.5%, which means if I translate into the real terms, municipalities have to increase their own revenues by almost 200 to 300% from the normal scenario. Now the question comes before us is that how do Indian cities achieve this? Especially the ones that are growing faster with high levels of poverty. And there are a few alternative sources that are assumed to play a key role in Indian cities, like we have value capture mechanisms, pooled financing, municipal bonds, etc. So I'll discuss about them after some time. But so I'd like to summarize here that in India, there is a need for higher share of grants from the central and state governments to have quality infrastructure in place in all levels of urban local bodies. And the second thing is that there should be a good research on the financial sustainability of urban local bodies. Indian cities need to exploit various sources to have the infrastructure in place. Moving forward, uh, yeah. So I just wanted to introduce some of the alternatives which have assumed to play a large role in Indian context presently. So there are advisory reports and research studies which have assumed that bond market or bond financing as one of the potential alternatives for Indian municipalities to raise revenues for the development needs. So I personally feel that it's one such source which can have higher magnitude of revenues to realize by municipalities. However, in India, a very few municipalities have exploited the bond market today. So as per the graph shown in this slide, if you observe, which is taken from the report prepared by Reserve Bank of India. So there has been a healthy market, healthy bond market in India till the mid 20th century, where the municipalities have raised more than 1,000 crores with an average issue of 130 crores each. But it came to halt after 2005 when the JNNORM mission was launched in the country. So a few people believe that when there are grants given by the state government or central government, the local efforts gets reduced. So, including the report which I've pointed out, infers that the JNNURM as one of the reason why the municipalities have given less importance to that. Nevertheless, the bond market or bonds issued by the municipal corporations are based on the credit rating. So, and we need to have few reforms in it. Um One has to be very clear that these funds, which are raised through bond financing, should not be utilized for any other purpose other than the purpose for which they are meant. This is very important. The international literature also talks about this. The uncertainty exists in it when you use this resource for some other purpose than the resource for which it is raised. So these funds have to be raised only when the municipalities or local bodies have a clear capital investment plans with them, and they do also have to have a clear financial operating plan with necessary institutional capacities, because if you don't have the institutional capacities at the end of the day, you can't have the successful target achieved in it. The second one, which was widely discussed, is the pooled financing and borrowings. I will not discuss much about borrowings because it's a debatable concern. So, when it comes to pooled financing, I personally feel this may work out well in cases where the ULBs are clustered or where they are located in close proximity. So there are municipalities with good technical competences which can meet the necessary requirements of the bond issue. So the small and medium ULBs located in cross proximity can access to the capital market through pooled financing strategy. So under a common bond, there is a common bond issued by the pooling agency. We can have an SPV constituted for it. So this SPV issues the bonds, and the debt what they raise is serviced through the pooled revenue of the participating municipal bodies. So it is very important that ULBs should stick to the user charges and pricing policies, as the uncertainty in this will result in financial difficulties. There are a few studies in India where, due to rigid uh, policies on not allowing the local governments to revise their pricing on various infrastructure, the projects could not achieve the desired outcome. It is very important that ULBs stick to the user charges and pricing policies. And I can assume from my research here that when you have an integrated infrastructure for ULBs, one can achieve the economies of scale and can reduce the average cost per unit, and ULBs can have a common pricing reform with a minimal scope for changes. But a very few case studies are there in India. We have few successful examples in Tamil Nadu. We have few in Karnataka. We have few. But yeah, as I said earlier, there are uncertainties involved in this. especially revising the tariff. And there are a few cases where market demand for such infrastructure also have played a role. But if you have a good team with you, this all these things can be addressed. So, in addition to what I have discussed in the previous slides, there are a few more which can be researched for increasing the finances of ULBs in India. For example, there are reforms required in user charges, there are reforms required in property taxes, considering the social equity and beneficiary pay principles. So we can also study and introduce the value capture mechanisms like congestion pricing, development different fee, which is a new thing which has not been widely practiced in India, but it has a lot of advantage with it. Lastly, governments should also increase the level of grants, because there has always been a debate in the policy level that infrastructure should be financed by the government through the revenues that they have and leave the operating of it to the ULBs. But yeah, presently in India, ULBs are held responsible for financing, so we must go with this that grants should be made available, and they should also extend the technical assistance to ULBs to have this resilient infrastructure in place. And there are a few spatial planning approaches or spatial strategies that will help in reducing the emissions through our plans. So I wanted to quickly introduce them uh, for the benefit of audience. So you must be knowing this. Some of you would have covered this in your lectures. It is it is estimated, and it was also seen in the previous presentation, that there is a lot of potential with us to reduce the emissions by having this low carbon measures. So the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs in India has come up with a climate smart cities assessment framework consisting of 5 themes and 28 indicators as on 2022. There is a recent report which I could not refer. Um, the 5 themes as presented in this slide focuses on urban planning, green cover, biodiversity, energy and green buildings, mobility, air quality, water management, and uh, waste management. So this slide presents you the indicators that were selected in the framework. So there is a latest report on climate smart cities framework 3 published in the year 2022. If anyone is interested, you can download and refer. So I could say one thing, that these are principal indicators, which means the indicators selected by the government have proven to have an impact on emissions. So if planners, architects address them in their spatial plans, we can assume that we are aiming towards low carbon strategies. Moving forward, I felt the suggested strategies on urban settlements by experts have a significant importance to Indian cities. So, as per the report published by IPCC in its fifth report, the key urban form drivers of energy and GHG emissions are 4 things. First one is density, land use mix, connectivity, and accessibility. I'll not discuss in detail on all of them, but I'll quickly tell you what it is. What is important here for us is that they are not to be regarded as independent. You should not treat them as independent of each other. They are interrelated and interdependent. So each element can help us to measure the impacts on the greenhouse gas emissions differently. But the report advocates that addressing them in isolation is insufficient for lower emissions. It becomes important for us to understand how this urban density in particular has an effect on GHG emissions from the literature. You all must be knowing about it, I'm sure. Here, urban density refers to the number of population residing in a particular area. It does not end there. It also refers to the number of jobs per unit area and number of dwelling units in a unit area. So if we try and understand the relationship between the density and the GHG emissions or vehicle kilometers traveled, the sporadic and low densities of population and low densities of employment and commercial land uses in India uh, will have the higher vehicular kilometers traveled and also emissions. So one has to see how we can achieve a desirable population density, employment density with a mixed land use so that the emissions from our cities or settlements are reduced. So there is a research which says if you address this appropriately, we can almost reduce up to 30% of vehicle kilometers traveled as on today. Um The second element is about the land use mix. Again, if you have a good proportion of land uses and their integration, the proximity to work centers and social facilities can be increased, as it was presented earlier in the uh, talk. And the literatures also highlight that the average elasticity between the walking and diversity of land uses is reported about 0.12 to 0.25, so which is very good. And we also have a few more like connectivity and accessibility. So referring to all of this, I made an attempt to present some points which requires a good research, which currently I'm working on. So as you might be aware that Indian cities have a variety of plans through which cities development is regulated or planned. It is observed in studies carried out by various uh, expert groups that the spatial expansions in Indian cities are growing at a higher rate as compared to the population. A very important measure what we had in the last 10 years. So this will have a significant effect on urban infrastructure and urban sprawl costs. There is a well researched area on this. So, and the same is the case with carbon emissions. So here I would like to draw your attention. A very few cities in India have proposed through their master plans to achieve moderate to high densities in ranging from 250 persons per hectare to somewhere 1000 persons per hectare. But as I said, they are very limited in number. And a very few plans focus about employment densities within this residential zones. In fact, no master plan clearly details of that. We have land use permissibility where we don't restrict having a mixed development in residential zones, but as such, there is no special focus given on employment density within these residential zones. So and there is also a need for long-term incentives enabled in the system for mixed use developments. We are somehow biased towards increasing the property tax revenues by charging more from non-residential land users, but it is a short-term measure. In fact, the long-term calculations have not been taken up. So if you incentivize that and achieve this desired mixed land use or land use integration in your plans, I definitely feel or assume that the overall cost to societies can be reduced to a very great extent. And the second aspect, which is important in our Indian settlements that we are experiencing, is about the small and medium towns. You must be thinking that it's not a so important topic, but let me tell you that UN projections and World Bank projections, there are many such studies which clearly point out that the absolute increase in population in India will be seen in the maximum proportion of that population will be seen in these cities which have population of less than 10 lakhs. And the financial capacities I have discussed about presenting my research there, it says they have less capacities as compared to higher. So how do we manage this ULBs and minimize their GHG emissions is something which is not coming out very well in the Indian policy or in the plans. And there is in fact, the framework that I was showing you a couple of slides before, they were also limited to only smart cities or few cities, but it has not been extended to all such cities which we're talking about. In my first slide, I think I've shown you that we have about 4,000 plus urban local bodies, and I can blindly assume that as on 2022, it must have crossed 10,000. And if you take the proportion of them belonging to this S&M, I can say it ranges somewhere between 70 to 80%. So there is another important dimension that is about the densities realized in urban areas. I was referring to about development different costs, which is not seen in Indian cases, but in international case studies, it is well taken care. What it indicates, I can simply say this, that the private costs do not reflect in the economy, where the economists and planners have to include the social costs to achieve the cost equal to total costs, which means you must be wondering what it is about. So we have proposed density norms in our spatial plans mentioning what is the maximum density to which one can permit. But there is no condition on minimum density. If it is left idle or if it is utilized to a very minimal extent, the effect of it is seen in the society, because of which the spatial expansions are happening. So there are a few countries where we can draw lessons that such practices are discouraged through penalties, or where their pricing systems are well accounting for all of this. So, with this, I think there are many things to discuss about, but with this, I conclude my presentation stating that there is a need to achieve a feasible population and employment densities in our Indian cities through mixed land use strategies with accessible and well collected neighborhoods. And planners and economics have to introduce reforms based on beneficiary pay principles and improve the economic efficiency of property tax, user charges, and improve the technical and financial capacities of ULBs for having resilient infrastructure in place. So, with this, I would like to thank once again the coordinator and the director of School of Planning and Architecture, Vijayawada, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. Thank you once again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your informative presentation on financing climate resilient infrastructure in the Indian context, where you took us through the in Indian context, what is urbanization, the climate change efforts that we are making in India, urban infrastructural conditions and the gaps that we are having. Because in Indian context, we have a completely different complex socioeconomic and infrastructure conditions. So it was good that you brought in that into the discussion, where you were telling us about the challenges, the consistency, and how we can future-proof our plans. The need for concentrated efforts at urban context because of the differential risk that because each Indian city is in different climate region, and there are varying levels of vulnerability and adaptive capacity that our Indian cities are at. So it's not a blanket approach that we can have, and it should be very specific and context specific. And lastly, you did conclude with taking us through infrastructure development with respect to climate change, taking through your detailed research on the status of municipal finance and the widening gap in the financing for climate projects at the ULB level, considering the status our ULBs are at, and the solution that you threw at the audience, kind of giving us a lot of thoughts that we can take forward for integrated infrastructure development projects that we can think of in the future, and also spatial strategies which relates to linking urban form, urban travel, urban density, urban infrastructure all together. So thank you very much, sir, for this informative session. And with that, I open the floor for all the audience to pose their questions, which they were keeping to themselves because we did not have, we moved from the first presentation into the second presentation quickly. So I request now all the audience, whoever is interested and who have been listening and who have a lot of provoking questions within them, thought-provoking questions. So I request the audience to pose their questions to both our experts today. Anyone? Any questions?
Sir,
Yes, Ashwati. So we have Ashwati from MEPM second year.
sir, I have a question to ma'am.
Um, Dear Ronald, ma'am, are you there? Yes,
Uh,
Ashwati. So yeah.
Hi, ma'am. This is Ashwati. I'm a final year student. If I'm doing masters in environmental planning and management in SPA Vijayawada. So I have a doubt, like from which you told about like cities and climate change. Um, Climate change has been responsible for many disasters, like we have been seeing throughout. Uh, so let's talk about the recent disaster that happened. Like the entire world has been talking about the Syria and Turkey earthquake that happened. So, ma'am, what do you think? Like, we all agree that climate change is one of the long-term reasons in causing such disasters, as in like such natural disasters. So, like, what are the like possible uh, like precautions that we have been taking for all these things in a longer period, ma'am?
Thanks, Aswati, for the question, and also thanks for this super interesting presentation that we've just had the pleasure listening to. Really, really great to get the Indian perspective. So thanks very much. I really enjoyed it. Maybe to come back to the question, I think we've seen now that the recent disaster in Turkey and Syria, I guess that's what you're referring to. I mean, earthquakes. I mean, there have been some preliminary studies that there's a link with climate change, but I would say from all the natural disasters, it's probably not the most obvious link linking earthquakes with climate change impact. Regardless, I think what still does hold is the fact that we are not building housing to be resilient enough. And that's a resilience towards, I mean, for earthquakes, that's resilient for fires, that's resilience for flooding. And there is definitely an overlap in these challenges as well. So, I mean, one of the big things here is globally, we are still investing a lot more into climate change mitigation rather than adaptation to climate change. Um, we've now had a bit of a breakthrough at COP27 with the goal of adaptation on adaptation. I think there will be, as this will be more discussed on the road to COP28, I think we will see hopefully a bit more push behind that. It's also, though, clear that financing, especially for adapting to climate change, we've had promises being made and promises being broken on providing a finance for adaptation. And I think my honest opinion is we shouldn't necessarily look into adaptation and mitigation as two separate buckets of investment and financing. For me, it's really about how can we have integrated approaches that on the one hand help us to reduce emissions but also help us to adapt to the effects of climate change. I mean, nature-based solutions are not only great for really greening the city, they are an opportunity to be provide sinks for flooding. It's an opportunity to tackle the urban heat island effect. But these can be, I mean, there's these mixed uses all around where we can have really positive impacts on a variety of levels. So that's something I would also like to see a lot more in going forward in city climate plans to really think about how can we reap the benefits of really this integrated thinking. I mean, just as an example, I mean, I've seen some planning on really great energy efficient buildings. They're in the middle of nowhere without access to public transport. So you have great net zero buildings, but people will definitely need a car to commute there. For me, that's not integrated thinking. For me, it's really about how can you build these neighborhoods so they are green, that they're energy efficient, that they are promoting walking, biking, and so on, to really reduce the emissions, but also use materials that are able to be more disaster resilient as well. And maybe just as a small example, here in Nairobi, there is one of the biggest slums in Africa, Kibera slum, and one of the big issues there is fire. I mean, fire hazards, and it is possible to have building materials that are a lot more resilient. They are also not a lot more expensive, but it is about bringing these solutions and technologies to the people where it's really needed, because it can make a massive impact. And they will, of course, also be better against urban heat. There will be, fire hazards will be reduced. They're better, for the rain that are evidently going to come in Nairobi during the rainy season as well. So how can we get these solutions to the people that need it the most? That's what I think is the $1 million question. I'll stop here.
Yes, ma'am. Like this same question, I have a different scenario. What about the landslides that have been happening due to excessive rain, which is obviously a very huge result of a climate change over a period of years? So, in those cases, what would be the necessary precautions?
Would you mind repeating the question? You were cutting out for me for a second. Sorry. Thank you.
What about the landslides that has been happening as a result of cloudburst or heavy rains, which has been happening over the hilly regions in down south of in the Western Ghats and all? Like in those cases, obviously those are the results of a climate change over the years. Like what on those things, ma'am?
I think the answer is pretty much the same here. It's about, first of all, who's living in these areas. It's usually typically the urban poor, the most vulnerable, who tend to not have access to really formalized housing. And here again, it's of course a mixture between how can we build houses that are more flood resilient, but also how can we ensure that we use nature-based solutions to really stabilize the ground, for example. I mean, this example that I brought with the mangroves, I think demonstrates that quite well. How can we restore the nature to really make sure that we can integrate these solutions that are beneficial I'm going to call it stabilizing the ground and making sure that we can reduce such flood risks, but also landslide risks for the houses that are then very close to these flood-prone areas. I think that one is actually, for me, a really good example of what can be done. And there are also other examples that can be done where it's really about making sure that on the flood-prone areas, you are working more with having parks there, so green spaces that are accessible, but then also can serve as a sink in case of flooding, and as a natural restoration, so to say, thing. But when there's no flood, they can also be used as recreational parks and for families and for sports and so on. And if you're interested in that topic, I'm very, very happy to send you a toolkit that we'll publish really soon. That's about nature-based solutions in cities and what policies can be done. Really happy to make that available once it's published within the next couple of weeks.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Do we have any other questions? Audience?
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes. Good afternoon, Rashid.
So I have a question to both the experts actually, which are actually both connecting questions. So the first question is, like there is this carbon pricing, like which is like I heard that it is generally applied to the industries. So this be done at the level of municipalities? If yes, in what ways can it be included into the value capturing techniques or any such techniques that helps the municipalities to generate their own revenue? And are there any best practices with respect to the same in the countries abroad?
Uh, with respect to Indian scenario, I can answer you.
Yes,
Maybe
yes,
from the international perspective, we can seek the advice of the expert.
yes, yes.
So in India, one thing which is very clear to us is that there are certain restrictions with the urban local bodies in bringing reforms in taxations, for which the state governments have to give approvals. Not in all states, but majority of the states in India, they have to seek the approval of the state government to have this done in their localities. And the point that you're discussing is something which cannot be quantified at the local level accurately because it has a regional effect, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so which means it has to be seen at a regional level or at a unit level, which goes beyond the city boundaries. So therefore, you need to account all those bodies which are involved in making this possible. But there are some like congestion pricing which can be directly seen at the city level where ULBs have that power to do. But if it is something which is beyond, then we have to rely on the state governments for their expertise and approval. So that is where there is a difficulty right now. So most of the advisories and Indian documents are talking about this, that the state governments should constitute bodies to have this advisory and make sure that the ULBs implement this. But I think I've introduced this in my presentation, if you remember, that about the energy. There are three things that we've talked about: sufficiency, if you recollect.
Yes,
So
yes.
there I mentioned about it. The climate resilient or the framework that I have introduced you has one such indicator which focuses on that. So that is the improvement which is seen in Indian case scenario. But I don't think there is any city where this carbon pricing has come in place.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, but we have a congestion pricing which accounts for this
Yes, I got it.
indirectly. Yeah.
Maybe to say on carbon pricing, I'm definitely not an expert. So I would, just honestly admitting that. So I'm not quite aware of what's happening at the local level. Um, at the global level, of course, that's happening. Just to what you also mentioned, sir, that the issue of congestion charges is definitely something that's happening. I mean, these are indirect measures in the end, right? I mean, indirectly, what we have seen is, rather than a carbon price, so to say, is you get additional benefits if you have low carbon vehicles, for example. So that's definitely something that's quite widespread. What does that mean? You have, some cities are restricting heavily access to their city centers if you have a highly polluting vehicle. And what we've seen is cities providing free parking if you have an electric or low emission vehicle. So these are indirectly measures to really, indirect carbon pricing measures, just from a little bit different perspective. That are happening. I mean, you could also make an argument that the subsidies that we've seen at the city level for cleaner technologies are also going into that same direction. It's not necessarily punishing the polluter, but alleviating the cost or making it more attractive to have a cleaner technology, specifically when it comes to heating. Um, this heating, providing financial incentives for heat pumps, for solar for hot water, solar hot water. Or what I find interesting is banning actually certain technologies for heating in the city. And that's, I think, to be honest, that's something that really excites me, because that's something we are most likely going to see quite a bit pushing forward, especially with the energy crisis, especially I would say in the United States and in Europe, where there's been quite a big of push on how can we get these polluting um, and very energy intense technologies out of the city.
Got it, man. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Any more questions from the audience?
Hello, sir. I
Yes,
have a question for ma'am.
yes, Mukti.
Yes, sir. I'm Mukti. I'm a student of environmental planning and management. So my question is regarding the phenomenon of climate migration of human beings, actually. So, given the permanence of the effects of climate change on a given area, can we like figure out if it is actually okay to bring back people to that area who have already migrated? Uh, they could have migrated because of various reasons, which could be either due to climate based disasters or due to change in their livelihoods due to climate change. So should we actually make an effort to bring them back to their original location, or is the place better off without them?
Thanks, Mukti, for that question. I think incredibly complex question that you're pointing at here. Um, I mean, I think, just to take a step back, we've seen the first migration happening due to climate change. I mean, there are also some studies that are suggesting that actually many of the violences that are breaking out in parts of the world are due to climate change. If you go to the root cause, or one of the root causes are climate change due to food shortages and just more intense, a shortage of water supply, political atmospheres and really violence in certain parts of the world. So there's some studies suggesting a link there. Not saying it's the only thing, but that it is a contributing factor to quite tense political systems. I mean, and then of course the question. I mean, I would always argue most people are not necessarily that they're leaving their homes because of a lack of opportunities and because it's threatening their livelihoods. Um, Nobody is, not many people are incredibly happy leaving their communities and their families behind if there's no other way to sustain their livelihoods. So I think the question of uh, do we need to make an effort to bring people back is, I think, an incredibly politicized one, because it goes beyond just climate change effects. I mean, if your home is destroyed because of a flash flood, you will look for a different opportunity. And if it keeps being repeatedly destroyed because of flash floods, you will most likely need to migrate somewhere else because there's not a different option available there. I mean, what we have seen, just to take an example that's maybe that is being politicized, but is interestingly, if you look in the United States, there are several insurances that don't insure certain properties close to waterfronts anymore. And that wouldn't be your typical, just because they say, well, the water's going to rise. We've already paid for full damages here 3 times, and it's going to happen another 20 times. We're not insuring this anymore. So there will be, so to say, relocation, so to say, necessary at one point. And with rising seawater levels and islands sinking, I mean, maybe this is me being pessimistic on a bad day, but I don't think we can really reverse these effects and bring these islands back, and the part of cities that are lost due to rising seawater levels. I think that will be incredibly. I mean, I don't think this is necessarily reversible. I think we can stop. Hopefully, we can stop this from proceeding too much. But the land that's been lost, I think, is lost, at least for the next foreseeable future. And I think then, if we speak about, people migrating because of loss of revenue and loss of agricultural harvest. Yes, there are solutions to that, how you can bring in systems in uh, you know increasing the harvest with less rainwater and so on. But this will be, if this will be, it's difficult. It means also a culture shift, maybe different plants, different systems, different revenue streams. So it's not a very easy answer to that, and I think also a heavily politicized answer to that. And I think there are many people now starting to work on this link between migration and climate change. For example, the International Organization of Migration is getting more and more interested in that topic. Also, UNHabitat, we're looking into more and more into the link between urban crisis and climate change, and how urban crises are being exacerbated by this migration and climate migration. It's definitely a topic that I think will receive more and more attention in the next coming years, and it will need to receive a lot more attention as well. I'll stop here.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mukti. Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions do we have? We had a hand raised. Hanuman, yes.
I have a question to sir. Good evening, everyone. This is Hanuman from Bachelors of Planning. So, sir, as you mentioned, small and medium municipalities have lower capacities of own revenue generation, and they are more dependent upon the state and the central. So, basically, state and the central have higher tax bases, and these tax revenue is being devoluted to the third tier of governments, which are the municipalities. So my question is, why not these grants are sufficient to make a climate resilient urban infrastructure, sir?
Yeah, very good question. That is what we are fighting for. Uh, but sadly, what is being made available to us is very limited of what they have committed, as it was also pointed out internationally. They do commit, but what is realized by us is very less. That is first thing. And second thing is, there are institutional capacities which we need to address at the ULB level to utilize these funds. Surprisingly, the recent report states that though the fund is available with the government for financing the infrastructure, ULBs were unable to tap it because they had some problem. And if you look into the issues what they had, it's all about how to satisfy the prerequisites set by those higher ups. So what is required, as I mentioned in my presentation, is that it's about enhancing the institutional capacities of this ULBs, because you hardly have one or two planners in a city to take care of everything. And the engineers what you have, they all have works to do. Apart from this, if we engage them onto these jobs, it is a very tiring thing, and they don't have that capacities to do that. And a very few ULBs have FOPs, CIPs, which is required by the SFCs or CFCs to deliver these funds. So it is possible, but if you, I mean, yeah, your question is valid. Uh, Governments should be increasing the levels of funds to take care of infrastructure funding in your India.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Hanuman. So, do we have any other questions from our participants? Audience, any further questions? Yes. So, assume that there are no further questions, all their concerns and their queries and thoughts are answered through both our speakers for the day. So, with that, I take this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks for today's session. I hope I'll go ahead with that. I hope the audience will allow me for that. There are no further questions, right? Okay. So, I take this opportunity for proposing the vote of thanks on behalf of SP Vijayawada to all who have been attending very patiently and contributing positively to this discussion. First of all, I take this opportunity to thank our Honorable Director, of SPA Vijayawada, School of Planning and Architecture Vijayawada, Professor Dr. Ramesh Srikonda sir, for spearheading this workshop series on building inclusive cities for a resilient and sustainable future. As a part of the SPAV collaboration with UNHabitat, next, I would like to thank all the distinguished experts from United Nations Human Settlements Program, Ms. Parul Agarwal, the country program manager, Ms. Mansi Sachdev, senior urban planner, our respected speakers who were patient enough to present as well as to answer all the questions that we were having. Ms. Leah Renalda, Climate Change and Urban Environment Team from UN Habitat, Nairobi, Kenya, and Dr. Prashant Vardhan, Assistant Professor, Department of Planning, School of Planning and Architecture, Vijayawada. All the deans, HODs, faculty members, other distinguished participants, and my dear students. Thank you all for attending this session. I hope that today's workshop has been successful in inculcating this new thinking and gaining knowledge from real-time case studies which our experts have presented and best practices across the globe on climate change and urbanization. Thank you all. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, expert speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you all.
you. Thanks for
Thank
the
you.
invite.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.